After more than 50 years, humans traveled back to the moon and made it home alive to tell the story. Artemis II launched on April 1, 2026, carried 4 astronauts around the moon, and ended with a splashdown in the Pacific Ocean on April 10th, not far from San Diego. But the question that left a lot of people wondering was this: if they made it all the way there, why didn't they land on the moon? The answer is more interesting than it may seem, because Artemis II was never meant to be a landing mission. It was designed as a crude deep space test flight, almost like a final dress rehearsal to prove that the SLS rocket, the Orion spacecraft, the life support systems, and human operations far from Earth could actually work before the next major attempt to reach the lunar surface. And that is exactly what makes this mission so fascinating. Because sometimes the most important chapter in history is not the one where a flag is planted in the ground, it is the one that makes sure someone can make it back home. For decades, humanity looked at the moon as if it were a glorious memory from the past. The Apollo era felt almost like a monument frozen in time. It had happened. It was magnificent. It was historic. But it seemed to belong to another generation. Then Artemis II changed that. This mission put astronauts back on a path to the moon and showed that crewed space exploration is once again a real, present, strategic project. The crew was made up of Reid Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen. And that lineup alone carries enormous symbolic weight. Hansen is Canadian, making the mission an international effort. Christina Koch represents a new generation of lunar exploration, and Victor Glover also marks an important milestone in this new phase of the program. This was not just a trip to the moon. It was a message to the world that the next space age will be different from the last one. But to understand their return to Earth, we first need to understand what kind of mission Artemis II really was. Many people expected an immediate repeat of the Apollo missions, with lunar orbit, descent, and astronauts walking on the moon. But NASA chose a different path. Before landing, everything needed to be tested with people on board, in a real, hostile environment with no room for error. Because sending hardware near the moon is one thing. Sending human beings there and making sure they can come home is something else entirely. Artemis II was an approximately 10-day mission. It left Earth, performed a lunar flyby, and returned home, traveling roughly 695,000 miles over the course of the journey. Its central goal was not to explore the lunar surface, but to validate critical systems under real conditions. Navigation, communications, habitability, Orion's performance with a crew on board, exposure to the deep space environment, and return procedures. In other words, the entire mission was built to answer the most important question of all. Are we ready for the next step? And here is the first major point that surprises many people. Reaching the moon does not automatically mean being ready to land on it. Landing requires an entirely separate set of technologies. It is not enough for the capsule to arrive near the moon. You need a lander capable of descending safely, operating on the surface, and then allowing the mission to continue. According to NASA's mission architecture, Artemis II is a crewed test flight around the moon, while landing missions depend on other spacecraft, systems, and stages planned for later in the program. So when someone asks, why didn't they land? The real answer is simple: because they were never supposed to. The mission was designed to be a decisive rehearsal, not the final act. And when you look at it carefully, that makes perfect sense. Space exploration is too expensive, too risky, and too complex to be driven by impatience. First, you test the route. Then you attempt the landing. That may sound less exciting to anyone hoping to see footprints in lunar dust, but it is exactly what improves the odds of success for the missions that come next. Another remarkable part of the mission was the return itself. Coming back to Earth is one of the most violent phases of any spaceflight. The Orion capsule had to re-enter the atmosphere at extremely high speed, enduring intense heat, powerful forces, and a brief communications blackout caused by plasma forming around the spacecraft. At the end of the mission, Orion splashed down in the Pacific on April 10, 2026, successfully closing the first crewed mission of the Artemis program. And there is one detail that makes that return even more symbolic. It was not just the return of 4 astronauts. It was the return of humanity to crewed deep space. Since the Apollo era, astronauts had continued orbiting Earth, visiting space stations, and conducting science in low Earth orbit. But the Moon remained an interrupted frontier. When Artemis II completed the journey out and back, it revived a capability that had seemed almost dormant. And there is more. During the mission, the crew reached a historic distance from Earth, surpassing the previous record for the farthest human spaceflight, which had stood since Apollo 13. That makes Artemis II not only a symbolic mission, but also a record-setting one. It was as if NASA were saying, "We didn't just come back. We came back by going even farther." But perhaps the most powerful point is this. Artemis II was not built merely to impress people with beautiful images of the Moon. It was built to build operational confidence. Every procedure tested, every system monitored, every physiological response from the astronauts, every trajectory correction, every decision made in deep space forms the foundation for what will eventually allow humans to maintain a more sustained presence around and on the Moon. This mission was less about spectacle and more about maturity, and that leads to an interesting reflection. Most people celebrate the visible parts of great achievements. The landing, the historic announcement, the flag, the unforgettable quote. But in reality, the behind-the-scenes work behind victory is almost always made up of intermediate steps. Artemis II is exactly that. It may look incomplete to someone who expected a landing, but in the proper context, it is essential. Without this kind of test, the next step would be far more dangerous. It is also worth remembering that Orion was designed precisely for this role, to carry astronauts into deep space, keep them alive throughout the journey, and bring them safely back to Earth. And when we talk about modern lunar missions, the return is just as important as the trip there. There is no glory in reaching the Moon if the crew cannot come home. That is why the successful splashdown in the Pacific was much more than a dramatic ending. It proved that the fundamental promise of any crewed mission had been kept. Explore, yes, but come home too. There is also an emotional side that many people miss. When the Artemis II crew returned to Earth, they brought back something that cannot fit into technical spreadsheets: a sense of the future. For a long time, talk of going back to the Moon sounded like a distant promise. Now it feels like a timeline. It feels like a sequence. It feels inevitable. Artemis II psychologically shortened the distance between the present and the next lunar landing. And in the end, that may be the greatest surprise of all. A mission without a landing managed to reignite, in the collective imagination, the same sense of wonder that a landing usually creates. Because it restored an old certainty humanity had almost forgotten. That deep space can still be traveled by real people, with real fear, real courage, and real risk. In the end, Artemis II did not fail because it did not land. Quite the opposite. It accomplished exactly what it was created to do: carry humans to the Moon's neighborhood, test the spacecraft under extreme conditions, and bring them safely back to Earth. And sometimes the most important step in a great achievement is not the one that makes the loudest noise, but the one that makes everything after it possible. So the next time someone asks why Artemis II did not land on the Moon, the answer is simple. Because this mission was not about planting boots on the lunar surface. It was about making sure that when that moment comes, humanity will truly be able to go, stay, and return. And after this historic comeback, that future feels much closer.